Hello, beautiful community. We're gonna be playing a game called Intellectual Taxi today. A few of you have asked me to comment on Tucker Carlson's conversation with Viktor Orban in the scheme of the global prospects of democracy. Quick apology. I haven't slept last night, so I am going to try to say words, and then later you're going to tell me if I've made any sense or not. Okay? So let's go. It's not surprising that before we get to the quotes from the interview, I want to put some foundations down. So let's begin doing that, and maybe say a little bit first about the generic features of Orban's project. And that's important because it's not just a local project, it's a global project. Not just because there is a new brand of authoritarian, not just because there's a new brand of authoritarian conservatism that is organically spreading around the world, but because actually there is the elaboration of a global alliance trying to propagate that kind of conservative authoritarian politics. Now, 4.872% of you are really freaking out already, having heard what I've just said. So you need a qualifier. So here it is. Conservatism has impeccable democratic credentials, right? There's nothing democratically wrong. You might despise conservatism, you might love conservatism, but it is normatively impeccable as far as its democratic credentials go. So we're talking about a deformation of conservatism, which means that in this conversation we won't talk about other deformations that are threatening our democracy. We're just talking about this deformation of conservatism that is happening on the right. Are there democracy-threatening deformations in the liberal center? Yep. Are there democracy-threatening deformations on the so-called left, which is really a kind of hyper-liberalism in Western culture today? Certainly in the United States, there is no left. In Britain, there is no left. That is a meaningful political force. Yes, there are deformations and threats there too. But because we are older than 4 years old, we're capable of talking about one threat while realizing that just because we're not mentioning any other threats doesn't mean that that threat might not be among the top 3 or 5 major threats, with the others being ones that could be discussed another time. So hopefully that 4.2 plus % of you are now feeling a bit less freaked out. 2 features to the Orban project in the generic sense of it. Number 1, a fake majoritarianism that says there is a majority of people in this nation who share certain basic values and who are tired of those being challenged. And we represent this majority, and the majority represents the nation. Now, this majority could be a fake construct, right, of political exploitation. It doesn't have to be a real majority, but the idea of the majority is absolutely a central pillar. It's the first pillar. And then it gets really interesting when we get to the second pillar, because that first pillar you could still identify in quite a bit of exclusionary, but not necessarily anti-democratic Western conservatism. The second pillar says that majority needs to be represented by a political force that once it gets elected should try to dilute all counter-majoritarian institutions until a situation comes about in which it is no longer possible for an opposition to win. Right? So it's that second step where the democratic credentials really break down. And the technique here is to asphyxiate the counter-majoritarian institutions, which is what we saw in Hungary. So you go for the media, you go for the courts, you go and, in a quite extraordinary way, take over the higher education system and so on. This does not have to lead to the 1930s. If these rigged democracies can sustain themselves without escalating the authoritarianism, without fascizing further, if they can sustain themselves in that kind of situation that they're in now, they might well do that. So we're not necessarily on a drift toward Belarus, but there is always the risk, because if an elite in the kind of rigged democracy that Hungary is eventually realize it has to go much further to stay in power, then that trend can continue, but it's not inevitable. So there's an absolutely elementary error that we make about our own societies having put these two things on the table. And we're going to talk about this error when I'm much fresher, because it's enormously important, but I'll have a little go now. We recognize this kind of majoritarian politics in our politicians when it's there. Might be an exclusionary majoritarian politics, but it's not yet challenging counter-majoritarian institutions, so it's fine. What we fail to recognize is when our politicians take that second step and they want to break counter-majoritarian institutions. And why do we not recognize it? Because our institutions are so strong that they are not easy to break. And all too often we end up looking at politicians who are trying to break the democratic game in our country, but because they can't, we assume that they're not trying to do it. And placing a politician into the right category here is of utmost importance, because it makes all the difference that if they are also getting a tick from us in that second sense, in that second democratically deleterious sense, if they're getting that tick, it's important we stand up and tell them, no, you ain't going to go ahead with this. We ain't going to let you, right? And that we also realize what are the effective ways of doing that, right? But if we don't recognize that slide from being a constitutional conservative, let's say, into being a conservative who wants to break the democratic game, we can't react properly. And because our institutions are so resilient, we consistently put politicians who are out to break the democratic game into a category of, well, they're pushing their luck a bit, well, they are exclusionary in their populism here and there, but fundamentally they don't want to break the course, they don't want to break the checks and balances, right? So it's important to make these diagnoses accurately. Now, I won't argue for any particular candidates, but I'll just make a couple of unargued for claims. In the United States, the conduct in Florida of DeSantis indicates that he is significantly in the second category, right? That doesn't mean if DeSantis were to become president, he would do what Orban did. He would probably not be able to do it. But DeSantis, given his policies in Florida, given the takeover of the higher education system he's attempting there, he is showing signs of the anti-constitutional conservative, right? Obviously, Trump is in that category despite the erratic nature of his personality. And somebody else who was, for all intents and purposes, drifting very much into that category is the ex-prime minister of this country, Boris Johnson. The current prime minister, Rishi Sunak, isn't in that category. He is just a spectacularly irresponsible entrepreneur, right? Who is simply exploiting the political materials before him for self-advancement. But he is not on any kind of a mission to break counter-majoritarian institutions. We're not Hungary. Histories are different. So whether we as Britain, the United States, or other major Western democracies. So let's put a few things on the table about Hungary, which make it more susceptible to this story that it's suffering now. And of course, it's a tragedy. I mean, Hungary is an absolutely extraordinary culture with an unbelievable contribution that runs far ahead the size of the population. Right now, as we speak, Hungary is as great a center for Western art music as any place in the world. It's an extraordinary culture. But it's more susceptible. Right? There's a history of strongman authoritarian rule before the Soviet period. There's the extraordinary tragedy of the Nazi ethnic cleansing, which took away so many Hungarian Jews that Hungary became a much less plural society. There are the difficulties of the post-communist transition. Elites weren't good enough. Elites weren't uncorrupt enough. The taste of capitalism was hard in the form in which it came. Not as hard as Ukraine or Russia, but hard. Resentment at the European Union grew and has been exploited. Right? The European Union is a kind of sort of ghastly cosmopolitan power coming to tell us how to live. The financial crisis of the end of the first decade of this century, the migration crisis of the middle of the second decade of the century, and so on. So there are some special circumstances there. But what we are looking at is to identify these more generic aspects of the project and see how they can be transplanted all over the West, all over the world. Now, a couple of words on Tucker. If you want to know more about the history of Fox as a cultural phenomenon, you can watch Divide and Conquer, Alexis Bloom's, and she's absolutely wonderful, a documentary from about 2018 about Roger Ailes. Tucker, of course, is for months and months now not with Fox. He's on Twitter. He is, even though so often when he listens to people he's interviewing, even though so often he looks sort of farcically lost and befuddled, that's a show. He is extremely on the ball. He is a master of producing a very effective show. And he has an extraordinary facility not just to react to the news, but in reacting to the news to make news. And the interview with Orban was a very effective piece of propaganda, nearly perfectly set up for domestic US consumption. It was better TV than Tucker's recent interview with Trump. Couple of words on Orban. Orban does the walk and not just the talk. So he's a highly disciplined, strategic, hard-nosed, formidable political actor who might not quite match Trump in communication facility, but he outmatches Trump 100-1 in terms of efficacy behind the scenes. Interestingly, I won't quite go into why, but now in the West, we are more at risk of living through an age of buffoonish populism, buffoonish exclusionary anti-democratic populism. There can be democratic populism, there can be constructive populism even. But we're going through the buffoonish period, and later we'll get to the hard-nosed, efficacious period that'll be even tougher to deal with. A few things that Orban said, which I'm not going to comment in detail because I kind of think the background we've given already speaks for itself. Ukraine is not winning. A different geopolitical approach is what we're doing here in Hungary, and it's allowing us to keep the country together. We understand that there are two camps globally, which is a kind of civilizational divide, and that's a divide between two cultures, a culture of narcissism and a culture of values. The culture of me, and a culture of it's not just me, it's also nation, values, God, family. Call back Trump, Orban says. If Trump were president, the war wouldn't have happened. Trump can also save the world from nuclear war. It's dangerous and unfeasible to have a NATO border between Ukraine and Russia. As far as settlement goes of the war, it's easy. Ukraine can't be competitive without US help. If USA cuts support, the war is over. Our current strategy might look appealing of supplying Ukraine with weapons, but it's just not going to deliver a result. In the end, it's not going to be enough to defeat Russia, Orban claims. Domestic remark again. Politics in the United States is led by intellectuals, and intellectuals are ideological, and ideology is exclusive. When a liberal says this is an interpretation of society, it means it is the only way to interpret society. Liberal used to mean freedom, Orban says, but now liberal means the opposite of freedom. You make hegemonic requests upon society, and requests in terms of values and in terms of a conception of what it means to be a human being. And to that we just have to say no, he says. From Tucker, I'll just put one line. Your media landscape, Tucker says, is much freer than ours with much more diversity. The pilgrimage to Budapest will continue from Western democratic, from Western politicians, from Western conservatives, other conservatives who are trending authoritarian. And there's already a history of people visiting Orban, not just political figures, but also certain kinds of cultural figures. Orban wants to build a kind of global alliance, and they want to learn some tricks and see which of them might be most easily transplantable to the United States, for instance. We'll talk about all of this much more. I hope this has given you a little flavor, but for now, lots of love and talk soon.